Hey everybody, Jason Burmis here. And as we have very historical things going on in this country that are, in my opinion, extremely unprecedented, I thought that it would be a very good time to look at not only historical martial law, but the founding of the three branches of government, which, in my opinion, we've pretty much all but abandoned: the judicial, executive, and legislative. But that's not the debate we're going to have today. There is no debate, really. Instead, we have historian and wily bearded gentleman, a friend of mine, Jason Mandresh, the founder of the day, joining us to not only discuss historical martial law and when we saw it in this country and really its country's birth, but then why the founders created these three branches of government and what were some of the key arguments to do so. So we have the founder of the day here. You can follow him over at Founder of the Day via YouTube or at the very same tagline right here at Founder of the Day on Twitter. Jay Mandresh, how are we doing?
I'm doing fantastic, Jason. Thank you so much for having me back on.
Well, I love having you on. Tell us, first of all, what martial law meant to the people that would become the revolutionaries against the crown and birth this nation.
Great question. When I first hear martial law, and for those of your viewers who don't know, I generally speak about the American Revolution, so we're keeping it to that today. But when I first think about it, I think about when Thomas Gage took over Boston just after the Boston Tea Party. Now, they didn't actually declare martial law. They didn't use that terminology, but that's essentially what happened. But what was interesting back then is the way they viewed rioting was a little different than we view it today. And I know that sounds out of left field, but nowadays when we think of rioting, we think of people just massively running through the streets, breaking things for seemingly no reason, blah, blah, blah. Back then, they didn't have democracy. Most of the people in charge feared democracy, and they called it mob rule. And the idea was, we can't have the mob running around. But what's interesting is at the time, the mob, quote unquote, their only tool, since they didn't have democracy, was rioting. Now, just to put this in perspective, Boston at the time of the American Revolution had about 16,000 residents, which I know you recently moved, but we know each other from Oneonta, New York, and that's about how many people live in Oneonta, New York. So that's how big Boston was at the time.
Which at the time actually would have been pretty booming, you know what I mean? You got to understand there isn't like a huge infrastructure here where we have our system of electrics. They're really building the infrastructure of that city at the time.
Well, exactly. At the time, at just 16,000 people, Boston was the second largest after Philadelphia in population in British North America. So this is a big city, but I challenge your viewers to go look and find the closest 20,000 population city in their area. And it seems much smaller today than it actually is. But I bring this up because at the time, what the mob would do is if there was a government official that was causing trouble, they weren't like today, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, they're figures on television. We don't know these people. At the time, your leaders lived in your town. And the mob would, quote, riot, and they would go to someone's house and break their windows. I mean, this is actually what happened with Ebenezer Richardson, a leader in Boston in 1770. And a mob, and at this point, a rioting mob could be like 20 people, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but they would go, they were breaking his windows. They were threatening to break into his house. His family was there, and he pulled out a gun and he fired a random shot, trying to scare people off. Unfortunately, this killed a boy named Christopher Cedar, who was only 8 years old. But this was just about a week and a half before another riot broke out where they surrounded soldiers and threw some rocks, and one soldier gets hit, and another soldier, who's a regular trained to kill, fires his gun, and it kills some people. And that turns into the Boston Massacre. So this was a very important tool, this violence, for the people getting their point across clearly.
So
Now,
let's talk about this for a second.
Yeah.
Of course, especially when we're talking about historical figures in government at this time period, they don't have bodyguards. They're their own bodyguards, hence why the politician himself is the one that fires off the shot. 20 people to one politician and his family is extremely intimidating. It would be intimidating today, but if you go to a place like Cuomo's house, obviously there's not only going to be bodyguards, there's going to be law enforcement surrounding it. And that's to peacefully protest, by the way. So I want to make sure people understand that. Here, you have something different, obviously. Now, as you said, this is independent. This is mob rule. This is maybe the birth of democracy without restraints because they're not allowing that. Again, no taxation without representation. One of the reasons that you see probably the most infamous of these, mob riots would be the Boston Tea Party.
Right. Well, one of the reasons I bring this up, and it might sound a little random to the martial law conversation, but one of the reasons I bring this up is because this was the atmosphere when 3 years go by, and then they have the Boston Tea Party, another one of these riots where they dumped what today would be the equivalent of $3 million worth of tea into the ocean. It's not like they threw some tea in the water. They wasted millions of dollars of product. And at this point, between the riots and other grievances the colonists had, well, the king and parliament said enough's enough, and they passed the Massachusetts Government Act. And this basically, instead of having the royal governor they had, Thomas Hutchinson was replaced with Thomas Gage, who was at that point commander-in-chief of all forces in British North America. And he arrived in Boston, that I said had about 16,000 people, with 3,500 troops of his own. So that's about a quarter's worth of the city. Now, now a fifth of the people in the city are soldiers, or essentially, as we would call it today, cops, for lack of a better term, or police officers. You know what I mean?
Or you would think to yourself, again, you want to talk about kind of a martial law authoritarian move. They've now removed the elected official that you already had to elect by their rules. They installed a military leader, and they brought with him not a new form of policing, if you will, not sheriffs that you were starting to see pop up in that kind of traditional, again, the people vote for it, they get deputized, that's your law enforcement, but literal military personnel, like you said, that would now make up 3,500 of roughly under 20,000 people. So like you said, 1 in 5. So, you could argue that this move by the crown in itself is a form of martial law without distinguishing that term upon the Americans.
Well, that's why I said they never used the term martial law, but for all intents and purposes, when Thomas Gage shows up with all these soldiers, and he starts doing things like banning meetings, and the colonial assembly, within a few months of him arriving, is now eliminated. Granted, and what they actually did, one of the reasons the war broke out is most of the people who were elected left Boston and still assembled and controlled things. And that's really, of course, Boston is where the revolution kind of comes to a head. Though I will note, one of the reasons the other colonies decided to join the fight is they had the same complaints as Boston. They didn't have the same, we'll say, rough and tumble attitude as Boston. I mean, New York City did. Some places did. But, Boston was the heart of it. And Boston, a lot of other colonies were saying, Boston, chill out. But once martial law is essentially declared, once Thomas Gage turns Boston into a military fort, that's one of the many things that really pushed people in powerful states like Pennsylvania and Virginia who didn't really want to go to war with the king. It's one of the reasons they said, whoa, if they're doing it there, they can do it here. And this just shouldn't be done.
And this almost brings us back to the last time I had you on to talk about the historical militia, because at that time, like you said, it was really frowned upon for you to be an able-bodied male in the community and not be a member of the militia, because in large part, these Americans were policing themselves and allowed to do so in mass. Don't get me wrong. There was law enforcement outside of that. But again, you talked about how the historical militia was something very, very different. Now, in turn, You have these riots, you now have military occupants, you have other states getting in there. How does the historical militia begin to play into this and, begin to form into what we know now as the revolution?
Interesting. So, as we discussed last time, the militia was already around and training. And one of the things that they didn't like about the regulars being there is kind of as we discussed last time. Why do we need you here? We're protecting ourselves. To which the British said, well, someone needs to protect our merchant trade from you, apparently. So since the militia was already around, they were already organized. So once this happens, many of the patriots flee Boston. Not all patriots, notably people like Dr. Joseph Warren, stay around and try and fix things from the inside because, again, a decade before this, when the Stamp Act was passed and there were the stamp taxes, well, the patriots, the colonists assembled and they filed their grievances with the king and their grievances were addressed. And in many ways, they thought this would still happen. However, this time what they did actually is they sent letters out to the other communities, and it was more than anything else, it was this occupation that led to the calling of the First Continental Congress. And they meet in Philadelphia, and all the other representatives of the other colonies are debating, do we, pull our militia together? Of course, we're going to train with them. But what New England does, not just Massachusetts, but very strongly Rhode Island and New Hampshire with Connecticut also, they call in their militias, they get them ready, and they form what we now know as the Minutemen, which were the best members of the militia who were ready to go at any time just in case. And furthermore, what they did is they actually started taking the gunpowder and taking it out of Boston before the British really show up, hiding it in different places. There's the Fort William Mary in outside Portsmouth, New Hampshire, same thing. So they are not necessarily preparing for war, but preparing to defend themselves. Because also keep in mind, they're not sure whether or not the king's going to send the might of the British Empire on them. They might just have to deal with these 3,500 troops. Who knows? And so essentially, when it comes to the militia, they were already there and they kind of doubled up, so to speak.
Very interesting. So let's now fast forward because, I don't want to get into the bloodshed, how it was won, who was on what side, who were the betrayers, who were like the bootlickers. Eventually, hey, we did it. We did it. Yeah, well, hey, we know there were bootlickers and backstabbers.
There were bootlickers. There always have been bootlickers.
There have always been bootlickers. When we finally get to the point where it's like, it's ours, we decide that there needs to be checks and balances. And we have the birthing of the three branches of government, the judicial, the executive, and the legislative. Now, first of all, I'd really like you to discuss how they came to those branches and why they did three for these checks and balances.
Okay, well, there are entire careers dedicated to answering that question, but I'll do what I can in summation. First of all, they took a lot of that from Great Britain because the king was an executive, and then Parliament was the House of Lords, or the Parliament is made up of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And that's essentially what we copied. But truthfully, all the states before this, during the war itself, came up with their own separate constitutions. And I should give a big shout out to John Adams, who actually helped write several of the states' constitutions. And while the Continental Congress was meeting years later, he actually published a 3-volume book while he was serving as minister to Britain, defending the constitutions. And so John Adams is a major reason we have this. Now, as far as the executive, a lot of the reason for one executive, because even today you'll hear people say, why don't we have a board of people? Well, war is important today, but war was even more important back then. And when you are at war, the theory goes that you need one strong commander to make a decision that everyone follows and goes down the chain, or else things can get dicey. I'm not arguing for or against that. That's just the idea at hand. And furthermore, these people were coming from a monarchy where they were accustomed to having a strong leader. It actually wasn't uncommon to talk about a monarchy. Actually, Prince Henry, the younger brother of Frederick the Great, was secretly contacted by certain founders to see if he wanted to be king of the United States. Didn't go anywhere, but they did want that strong leader at the time for the most part. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as the House and the Senate, that was a great debate in itself that went on most of the summer, how that would be constructed. But the idea was that the laws would be made by the people, and the Senate was supposed to represent the states. The Senate wasn't elected until the early 1900s. They were just chosen by the state governments, which themselves were also elected by the people. So the idea was to kind of mix as much in there as you could to make sure no one could really take over. What's really interesting, though, is the judiciary, because the Constitution does not speak much about the judiciary. In fact, the Supreme Court is in there, doesn't say how many people, doesn't say what it does. It doesn't say anything about all the federal judgeships throughout the United States. That's actually left up to Congress. And one of the most important things ever done in the history of the United States was the Judiciary Act of 1789. And then there was a second one in 1781 where Congress created the judicial system. Mm-hmm. Big shout out to Oliver Ellsworth, one of the main players over there in that, who would go on to be a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court shortly thereafter.
So let me just stop you. Basically, you're telling us, and I want you to continue, that there was an evolution after that first constitutional document, and when they started to see that they were going to get away from a monarchy. You know, obviously the Congress had been formed, that they saw the need for these different branches and to empower them and limit them as such so that they would be checks and balances.
Absolutely. But like you said, evolution's a great word, because it wasn't until, I believe, 1802 or 1804, it was about 10, 15 years after the Constitution was passed, when John Marshall, who was the fourth Chief Justice, oversees the case of Marbury versus Madison, which is a name you might remember from grade school, but not why. What John Marshall actually did, and the Supreme Court did, is they gave themselves the power of judicial review. So the Supreme Court gave itself the ability to determine if laws are constitutional when they come out of Congress. That's not in the Constitution. That was just part of the evolution of the government itself. There was a lot of feeling it out for the first few years there.
Feeling it out. I like how you put it, Jay.
Essentially.
So when would you argue then, post revolution, post these institutions being put in place, that each of them were at their strongest? And I know that we don't usually love to incorporate modern history, but where do you think they are at strengths today? Because you could argue, for instance, the executive branch is no longer held by the president. I mean, he's the executive, but what is he an executive of? Almost nothing at this point. But again, let's get your opinions of when, again, these institutions, the judicial, the executive, and the legislative branch were at their strongest.
Well, it's interesting you use the word strongest and not the word best.
No, I you know what? Because let me explain why to the audience. Because I would argue there would be peaks and valleys to all of those in historical context of when they were the most powerful of the three. So, yeah, I mean, we could make another argument, for instance, when they worked best for the people. You know, you could throw that in too, but I'd love to hear where you think, in other words, executive power is so strong. President says, not much debate, we're doing it. You know what I'm saying? But continue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the easy answer is the Supreme Court, and it's right now. The Supreme Court nowadays is the House and the Senate are basically passing in my opinion, seem to be passing the responsibilities for lawmaking over to the Supreme Court. And like I said, when the Supreme Court was created, when the judicial branch, Congress created the judicial branch. They didn't put a lot of thought into it. They put in a lot of thought into it, but it wasn't supposed to be powerful. It was like, instead of three equal branches, the judicial system was supposed to be like the third small branch. Mm-hmm. But nowadays it's, really, really important and really powerful. As for the president, like the executive branch, like who's the most powerful president? Like everyone you're watching can argue someone different. Like I would probably say, I want to say FDR, but that's only for part of his 12 years. Andrew Jackson's was very powerful. In fact, literally didn't listen to Congress or the Supreme Court on several occasions, including, we have the Trail of Tears as a sad note in history. And that's like John Marshall was still there 30 years later. And the Supreme Court said, no, the Native Americans sued for their right to stay on the land they owned and won. And
I would also argue, though, but, you talk about Jackson and, he beat the banks. He beat the banks. They wanted on his tombstone.
Jackson's a fun character because, Jackson beat the banks, right? And he was a man of the people for sure. But you want to talk about martial law? Do you know when the first time they used the term martial law was just after Jackson famously won the Battle of New Orleans, and he declared martial law in New Orleans because he heard rumors the war was over, but news traveled so slowly he didn't necessarily believe it. And then there was a person imprisoned for sedition, and there was a judge who said, no, you can go out on bail. And Andrew Jackson had the judge arrested. So Andrew Jackson is one of those fun figures in history where some things he did were really, really great, and some things he did were really, really terrible. We had no fun. He got.
I get it. Listen, not so much fun, but to show you that life is and always has been at that level. Game of Thrones. Right?
Yeah.
It's not like somebody's a superhero or a supervillain. There are shades and, again, peaks and valleys and personalities. And I got to tell you, Jay, this is why we love having you on, because we get to have these high-level historical conversations that do reflect, I think, in many ways, where we are right now. This is Chaos 2020. I don't think it's going away in, 30, 40 days magically when somebody gets inaugurated, obviously. I think that our constitutional republic is very much so in trouble. I think that, you walk up to 9 out of 10 people in the street and you ask them what a constitutional republic is, and they don't even know the United States is one. That's
what's really interesting, because talking about today and how divided people are and where we've gone. There were several revolutions during the American Revolution. And one of the most important things that happened during this time period is actually when John Adams, because, Washington was president, and then John Adams was president, and then Thomas Jefferson was president. And Adams lost after his second term and peacefully transitioned power to the opposite party. And up until that point in history, it almost never happened. And well after that in history, when a revolution happened and one party took power and then another party took power from that party, it's almost always violent. And John Adams handed over the keys of the administration, and Thomas Jefferson gave his famous inaugural speech where he said, we are all Republicans and we are all Federalists, which were a different Republican party. But the point is, we're all Americans here. And it seems that we're kind of losing a lot of that today. Whatever your viewers think of who should have won or how it should be, if it was rigged, probably. But
we can't say that. Whoa! They'll take me off of YouTube. Listen, we're not even allowed.
So honestly, here's the thing, bro. I don't.
They literally sent out a thing today, Jay, just so you understand how crazy things are. And I'm not saying anything, and neither is he, about the election.
I don't talk about modern politics on my channel.
I'm just saying, they literally said, if you think it was rigged or you think that there was any kind of voter fraud, they're going to take your videos down from now on as of today, because it's been certified in so many states. Listen, I don't want to... We can get into free speech.
Yeah, that's not my point.
Yeah.
My point is the people themselves.
Yeah.
We're so divided.
My point is this,
the
Jay.
whole point of America is we can solve our problems.
There are just so many people out there that don't even believe in the Constitution and Bill of Rights anymore. They think we need to get rid of it. They're ready to bow down to global government. They love the UN. They think we're going to Mars. There's a lot of problems. But
you should have me back on, and we'll talk about the anti-federalists, because when the Constitution was passed, about 48% of Americans didn't like the Constitution.
Well, so I'm heading to D.C. this weekend. I'll be at D.C. this weekend, but we'll have to catch up in the next couple of weeks, and definitely before the inauguration. Tell people about your website, founderoftheday.com. Tell them about the YouTube channel, and tell them what they can expect coming up from Jay Mandrush.
Founderoftheday.com. I write articles 5 days a week about the American Revolution. I try and focus on obscure American founders and lesser known stories of the revolution. And I put out videos 5 days a week at Founder of the Day right here on YouTube. So check that out. Got a live video tonight. Wednesdays, we do a weekly wrap-up of all the founders I learned about this week. Friday, we do trivia. And actually, tomorrow, I just shooting a video about the first veto, George Washington's use of the first veto in history.
Well, excelente, my friend. We will keep in touch. Thank you so much for doing this, Jay. And people need to go subscribe to his channel immediately. We will see him hopefully in a couple of weeks. So Founder of the Day is the place to be. I want to remind everybody that, it was a history lesson, but YouTube probably tells you that what we talked about was harmful content. I'm certainly demonetized on this video and every other video. So $5, $10, $15, big donors, you mean the world to me. Again, headed to DC. I'm probably going to be driving out there sometime tomorrow afternoon, doing it on the fly. We do it live. Could use your support. Big donors, thank you so much. Make sure you have the free account. Today's was not live, but it certainly was free. And it was up there, and it still is. It's 90-plus minutes long. And I'm warning you, it is a free-for-all with action for Assange, Nico House, who's also on the platform, the Convo Couch. And let me just tell you guys, it's one you're going to want to catch. It's a big one. It's a 90-minute broadcast. So thumbs this video up, subscribe, and share. I hope you enjoy something a little bit different every once in a while like that. Loose Change, Final Cut, Fabled Enemies, Invisible Empire, A New World Order to Find, and Shade the Motion Picture are free right here, right now. Thanks for joining me, guys. I love you, and I'll see you on the flip side.